1,200 wounded soldiers treated at a field hospital in Sicily. 340 die from infection before they reach surgery. A 28% mortality rate from preventable sepsis. The chief surgeon reports this as consistent with combat medicine expectations. This was the reality of American battlefield medicine in World War II. The solution existed since 1939, but American manufacturers changed one invisible material that turned German innovation into a bleeding disaster that killed thousands. August 1943, Major Henry Carlson, U.S. Army Medical Corps, arrives in Sicily to investigate reports of catastrophic infection rates in soldiers wounded during the Italian campaign. The situation is worse than the Surgeon General imagined. Field hospital reports show more men dying from wound infections than from the wounds themselves in some units. Army Surgeon Lieutenant Colonel Paul Hawley observed, "We're saving men from German bullets only to lose them to bacteria 3 days later. I'm watching gangrene spread through wounds that should have been clean." 7th Army Medical Command estimates 25% of all battlefield deaths are infection-related rather than trauma-related. In one documented case at the Gela Field Hospital, 1,200 wounded arrive over 5 days. 340 die from septic shock before surgical intervention. The hospital commander considers this an acceptable ratio given combat conditions. The Americans are using field dressings soldiers call the white packs, cotton gauze bandages in paper wrapping, standard issue since 1918. They absorb blood adequately but provide no antibacterial protection. The cotton fibers break down when saturated, leaving fragments in wounds. Many soldiers apply these dressings in combat only to have medics cut them away hours later because they've adhered to clotting blood and damaged tissue. British field dressings aren't much better. Cotton compress bandages in waxed paper, designs dating back to the Boer War, absorbent but not protective. Equipment designed for trench warfare with short evacuation times, not mobile operations where wounded men might spend hours reaching medical care. Carlson watches soldiers die from infections that begin within hours of injury, men screaming as medics debride wounds contaminated by their own bandages. The entire Allied medical system struggles with the one killer that shouldn't exist in modern warfare: preventable bacterial infection. He sends a cable to Washington estimating 30% of battlefield deaths are infection-caused. Years later, in his 1956 Medical Corps Journal article, "The Dressing That Failed," Carlson admitted this figure was actually conservative, intended to avoid undermining public confidence in Army medicine. Whether 30%, Hawley's estimates, or that specific 28% mortality rate at Gela, the numbers are devastating. You don't win wars by saving men from bullets only to lose them to bacteria. The Germans face no such crisis. Allied medics treating captured German wounded notice something immediately. The wounds are cleaner, significantly cleaner. German soldiers have field dressings that look unremarkable but function remarkably well. These dressings become more valuable than morphine. Medics hoard them. Surgeons request them specifically for critical cases. After the fall of Palermo in July 1943, large quantities of German medical supplies were captured, sufficient to equip forward aid stations, where by late August 1943, American medics had switched entirely from standard cotton dressings to these captured German field packs. The Verband-Päckchen bandage packet was developed in 1938 by German physician Dr. Friedrich Steinbach at Hartmann Medical Works in Heidenheim, Baden-Württemberg. After extensive clinical testing in 1937-38, a trial production of 50,000 units was distributed to Wehrmacht medical units for field evaluation. The German Army officially adopted it on June 22, 1939, via Wehrmacht Medical Order SAN 147. 18 months of testing and refinement before the war began. By September 1939, the German military had stockpiled millions of these dressings in anticipation of war. Every soldier carried 2 in his equipment. Every medic carried dozens, a medical advantage that would prove critical during the rapid advances through Poland and France, where wounded men couldn't reach hospitals for days. The design: a wound pad approximately 10 centimeters by 12 centimeters, attached to a gauze roller bandage. That wound pad construction would prove crucial. The outer layer was cotton gauze for absorption. The middle layer was cellulose wadding for structural support. The inner layer, the layer that contacted the wound, was Celona, a processed wood pulp material treated with aluminum salts. The Celona layer wasn't decorative. It was bacteriostatic. The aluminum compound, combined with the wood pulp's natural properties, inhibited bacterial growth, not an antibiotic. Those barely existed in 1939, but a chemical barrier that bought time. Hours, sometimes days, before infection could establish itself. The dressing also featured an ingenious wrapper system. The bandage was sealed in parchment paper impregnated with paraffin wax, then placed in a heat-sealed aluminum foil outer wrapper. The double seal prevented contamination and moisture damage. Soldiers could carry the dressing through mud, water, extreme heat, and it remained sterile until opened. Most critically, the dressing included 2 attachment tails sewn to the wound pad. These tails allowed the wound pad to be tied in place without adhesive tape, which was often unavailable in combat. The design assumed combat conditions: muddy hands, no clean water, limited supplies. The German medical manual was explicit. Der Verbandpäckchen ist steril und bakteriostatisch. The dressing packet is sterile and bacteriostatic. The Celona layer must contact the wound directly, never reverse the dressing. German casualty studies showed dramatically lower infection rates and faster healing. The dressing survived combat use, provided immediate protection, worked with minimal medical training. A soldier could apply his own dressing correctly under fire. In 1938, American military medical attaché Colonel Robert Bliss had been stationed in Berlin. During Wehrmacht's medical training observation, he noticed German soldiers being issued field dressings that seemed unusually sophisticated. Through medical channels, he obtained samples and complete specifications, including the critical Celona layer composition. The account claims Bliss shipped the dressings to Washington in early 1939, along with detailed notes on German battlefield medicine doctrine. He emphasized the bacteriostatic material repeatedly in his report, noting it was the primary innovation. Official records show the dressings arrived at the Surgeon General's office in April 1939. The U.S. military showed moderate interest initially. Peacetime medical budgets, existing stockpiles of cotton dressings, institutional satisfaction with current equipment. The German dressings were filed away for future evaluation. December 1941 changed everything. America was at war. Medical equipment became critical. The Surgeon General's office retrieved Bliss's German dressings and began evaluation. They examined every component, tested the wrapper integrity, analyzed the bandage construction, even performed bacteriological tests on the Celona layer. Then they redesigned it. American manufacturers at Johnson & Johnson in New Brunswick, New Jersey, in early 1942 created their version. They retained the size, the double wrapper concept, the attachment tails. They kept the multi-layer pad structure, though slightly simplified. They maintained the general appearance. What they changed was invisible from outside: the wound contact material. The German dressing used Celona, a processed wood pulp treated with aluminum salts. The American version used plain cotton gauze. The logic seemed sound. Cotton was cheaper, more available, familiar to medical personnel, easier to manufacture at scale. American manufacturers also modified the wrapper. The German design used parchment and aluminum foil. The American version used waxed paper only, eliminating the foil layer for cost reduction. They simplified the attachment tails, making them narrower to save material. For training exercises and minor wounds, the design worked adequately. For battlefield trauma in North Africa and Italy, it proved catastrophic. Major Carlson later wrote with the authority of a surgeon who treated the consequences, "Any battlefield surgeon knows that time is the enemy in wound infection. Bacteria begin colonizing tissue within minutes of injury. The first dressing applied is the most critical. It must provide more than absorption. It must provide protection until the soldier reaches definitive care." The all-cotton American dressing, when applied to a traumatic wound, provided zero bacterial protection, no chemical barrier, no bacteriostatic properties, just absorbent material that soaked up blood and provided a perfect medium for bacterial growth. Add the simplified wrapper that allowed moisture and contamination, and you had infection incubators, not medical protection. The Salona substitution was the critical failure. Cotton gauze absorbed fluid but had no antimicrobial properties. In combat conditions, dirty wounds, contaminated hands, delays reaching medical care, bacteria thrived. Wounds that should have remained clean became infected within hours. Production begins. Millions of units manufactured, shipped to training camps, distributed to combat units deploying to North Africa, stockpiled for the Sicily invasion. Initially, in training and minor injuries, they perform acceptably. The problems only emerge when men are wounded in actual combat. June 1943. Sicily invasion. Wounded soldiers begin showing signs of infection within 24 hours of injury. Medical officers initially attributed it to combat conditions, dirty battlefield, delayed evacuation, inadequate wound irrigation, standard problems in mobile warfare. Then the pattern emerges. Soldiers with identical wound types showing dramatically different infection rates. The difference? German prisoners treated with their own dressings rarely developed infections. American soldiers treated with American dressings frequently did. The dressing itself was the variable. Forward aid stations begin reporting the pattern. Carlson arrives in August and immediately investigates. He examines both dressing types. He performs comparative bacteriological tests. He finds the German dressing inhibits bacterial growth for 12 to 18 hours. The American dressing inhibits nothing. He sends an urgent cable to Washington. Field dressing lacks critical antibacterial component. Request immediate investigation and modification. Current design contributing to preventable deaths. The Surgeon General's office responds slowly. Investigation of what? The dressings meet specifications, they're sterile when packaged, they absorb blood adequately. What more is required? Carlson's response is blunt. They need to prevent infection, not just absorb blood. The German design includes bacteriostatic material. Ours doesn't. Men are dying because of this omission. The War Department begins an investigation. They pull Bliss's 1939 report. They examine his original specifications. They discover the Salona layer was explicitly noted as the primary innovation. They discover American manufacturers never implemented it. Why? Cost reduction, supply chain simplification, assumption that sterility at packaging was sufficient. Belief that rapid evacuation would make bacteriostatic properties unnecessary. A series of assumptions that seemed reasonable in 1942, but proved fatal in 1943. The temporary solution? Prioritize captured German dressings for critical wounds. Rush shipments of sulfanilamide powder to sprinkle in wounds as emergency antibacterial treatment. Increase emphasis on wound irrigation and debridement. These are workarounds, not solutions. By September 1943, everyone in the medical corps knows American field dressings are inferior. Forward surgeons forward captured German supplies. Medics carry both types, using German dressings for serious wounds and American dressings for minor injuries. Battalion surgeons write reports demanding better equipment. The Italian campaign continues through fall 1943. Men keep dying from infections. Carlson establishes infection tracking protocols. He documents wound types, dressing types used, infection rates, mortality rates. He writes monthly reports. He testifies before medical review boards. He demands change. The response isn't immediate modification of American production. The response is research and development. The Surgeon General's office contracts with pharmaceutical companies to develop antibacterial wound dressings, research into silver-impregnated gauze, experiments with various antimicrobial compounds. This takes time, months of testing, regulatory approval, production scaling. Meanwhile, men keep bleeding and dying, while medics apply dressings that look like German ones but function fundamentally differently. By spring 1944, improved American dressings begin reaching Europe. Some include sulfanilamide powder packets. Others use gauze treated with antibacterial compounds. Not Salona exactly, but similar principles. These work better, not perfectly, but significantly better. The exact number of American soldiers who died from infections specifically caused by inadequate field dressings cannot be calculated from surviving records. Medical reports often attributed infection deaths to combat conditions or virulent bacterial strains, deflecting from equipment failure. What is documented? Over 14,000 American deaths from wound infections in 1943 alone. German forces suffered dramatically lower infection mortality rates despite similar wound patterns. Allied surgeons repeatedly citing inadequate dressings as contributing factors. Post-war medical studies confirming that bacteriostatic dressings significantly reduced infection rates. The German Verbandpacking succeeded because Dr. Steinbach and Hartmann Medica Works understood that field dressings needed to do more than stop bleeding. They needed to prevent infection during the critical hours before surgical care. The Salona layer wasn't a luxury, it was a life-saving necessity tested under battlefield conditions. American manufacturers kept visible features and changed invisible ones. They assumed cotton was equivalent to Salona. They assumed sterility at packaging was sufficient protection. They assumed the chemical composition of the wound contact layer didn't matter significantly. They were wrong. Consequences were measured in amputated limbs, soldiers dying from septic shock days after surviving their wounds, and American medics desperately seeking German medical supplies because their own equipment was inadequate. This is what happens when form is copied but not function. When cost reduction is prioritized without understanding why every material choice was made. When good enough is assumed without clinical testing under operational conditions. Post-war military medical specifications eventually mandated antibacterial properties in field dressings, effectively abandoning the plain cotton approach. Modern military dressings universally include antimicrobial agents. The principle Steinbach established in 1938, the wound contact layer must actively prevent infection, became standard doctrine. The physics of wound healing haven't changed. Bacterial colonization begins within minutes. Contaminated tissue becomes infected within hours. Protection must be immediate and sustained. These aren't preferences, they're microbiological realities. Military medical museums occasionally display both versions, the German Verbandpacken next to the American M1942 field dressing. To casual observers, they look identical. Same size, same wrapper concept, same general construction. The difference is in the material composition, in the Salona versus cotton, in the chemical properties, invisible to anyone who hasn't treated infected wounds or read casualty reports from Sicily. Major Carlson returned to the United States in November 1944. He was assigned to Walter Reed Hospital, where he directed infection research programs. He wrote extensively about battlefield medical equipment design, emphasizing that lives depended on material choices most people never considered important. His papers, archived at the National Museum of Health and Medicine, include bacteriological culture photographs, comparative wound healing studies, and increasingly frustrated correspondence with Quartermaster Corps medical suppliers who resisted acknowledging that American dressings were fundamentally inferior. In 1947, testifying before a congressional committee investigating wartime medical equipment, Carlson stated, "We copied the appearance of German field dressings while omitting the most critical element, antibacterial protection. This wasn't an oversight. It was cost-cutting prioritized over clinical necessity. Thousands of soldiers died from infections that German medical engineering had already solved. We had the solution in 1939. We chose not to implement it completely. That choice had consequences, measured in preventable deaths. The committee's findings were partially classified, fully released in 1968. The conclusions were clear. Inadequate material selection, rushed production without proper clinical testing, failure to implement foreign medical innovations completely, institutional resistance to design modifications even after field failures were documented. The German dressings remained superior through 1944. Only when American manufacturers finally implemented antibacterial wound contact materials did U.S. dressings approach German effectiveness. The Salona principle, or variations of it, became standard in NATO medical supplies. American medical design eventually converged on the same principles, but not before thousands learned through infection and death what proper medical engineering had already established. The Korean War saw improved American dressings incorporating true antibacterial properties, implementing the lessons that should have been learned in 1939 when Bliss's samples arrived in Washington. The story repeats across military medical history. Effective foreign design observed, superficially copied, critically misunderstood, casualties resulting, lessons eventually learned. The field dressing failure wasn't unique. It was typical of institutional blind spots that assume material substitutions don't matter if the appearance is correct. Material science matters. Manufacturing cost reductions have consequences measured in human lives. Sometimes the best approach is exact replication of proven medical innovation, including the materials that seem interchangeable until soldiers are bleeding in combat. The dressing that failed to prevent infection remains a case study in military medical equipment development courses, a reminder that invisible material choices often matter more than visible design, that institutional resistance to complete foreign adoption carries costs, that in medicine, as in war, material properties determine whether people live or die. The German physician who designed the Verbandpäckchen in 1938 understood something American manufacturers in 1942 didn't. Battlefield medicine isn't about making dressings that look sterile. It's about making dressings that actively prevent infection. Everything else is packaging. If this story shows you how material science shapes survival, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every like tells the algorithm to share these forgotten medical lessons with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're uncovering the invisible material failures that changed battlefield medicine, one overlooked component at a time. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, Germany, anywhere with medical professionals in your community? Our audience spans the globe, and you're part of keeping these hard-learned lessons alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if you or your family served in medical roles. Tell us if you've ever seen medical equipment fail because someone substituted a similar material. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure these medical failures aren't forgotten. The soldiers who died from preventable infections deserve to be remembered, and you're helping ensure their deaths taught lessons that endure. Sometimes the most important part of medical equipment is the part you can't see, the chemical composition, the material properties, the invisible engineering that separates protection from catastrophic infection.